Thank you all for joining us for our Faith in Action panel. For those of you guys who are watching from the comfort of your own devices, we decided to put together this Faith in Action panel as a sort of add-on to a book study that we just finished at our church called, we read through Woke Church by Dr. Eric Mason, a book that really deals with racial injustice and racial justice and how the church can participate in bringing God's kingdom to this nation, to local communities, through a heart that seeks justice, reconciliation, and repentance. That's not necessarily the topic for tonight. We've have resources available if you're interested in that book study. There are discussion questions and introductions to each chapter that will be made available for you. Tonight, we're really going to focus on what it looks like to serve locally and to help bring about that justice through local organizations. One of the biggest realizations I think that I had in the midst of this book study was that as important as broad strokes are, and as important as national level and global level justice initiatives are, and how important systemic justice is, and that we need to advocate and be involved and aware of justice at that scale, so much of the work happens at a local level. So much of the work happens by individuals like you and me being the hands and feet of Jesus in the midst of this, whether that's through straight up, parachurch ministries or church organizations, or through secular organizations and opportunities that we decide to bring our faith into, to be incarnate, to pursue Jesus and be like Jesus, and that to help bring about a more just society that better reflects him and help love those who are marginalized and most affected. And so I'm really excited about the guests that we have for our panel today. And I will let Brian Min, one of the elders at our church and one of the co-leaders of our Woke Church book study, I'll let him introduce them, and then we'll really just jump in and ask some questions. So excited for that tonight. Brian, why don't you introduce us to our guests?
Thank you, David. And what a privilege. I am just really pleased that we have friends here today, Frankie Moore, Laurie Hader, Kavar Reed. You're going to hear a lot more about what they are doing. And so just briefly, Frankie Moore has been part of our church at Grace Bible Church since about 2015. Frankie works with Community Action Network. It's an organization that we as a church have partnered with and supported recently. But it's based here in Washtenaw County, and they work to serve under-resourced neighborhoods in diverse ways through education, housing stabilization, community building programs. And so it's going to be really great to hear from Frankie about her work and the way her faith has informed what she does there. Kavar Reed, I am really happy to meet for the first time tonight. Kavar, I just realized that your dad is a pastor like mine, so another PK, nice to meet you. Kavar is at River of Life Church in Belleville, where he serves as youth director. He has a PhD in American culture from the University of Michigan, where I work, and is also instrumental at the university in helping to lead Wolverine Pathways, which promotes college and career access among students from underserved communities in Ann Arbor and surrounding neighborhoods. So, Kavar, I'm really pleased to have you with us. Thanks for coming. Laurie Hader, those of you who have been at Grace Bible Church, we know Laurie. She has been a bedrock of service in many capacities over the years. I met Laurie when my kids were at Awana, and she was helping to lead our Awana ministry. She's also helped lead many folks in service opportunities at Alpha House. And tonight she's going to share about the work that she's been doing with Prison Fellowship, particularly at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility nearby here in Ypsilanti. In her spare time, Laurie Hader is the mom of 7 kids. And so, Laurie, for someone who's done so much, it's really a pleasure to have you with us tonight. So looking forward to this. Back to you, David.
Awesome. No, thank you. And I love the personal connections there. I have been super blessed to get to know both Frankie, Laurie, and Brian over the past several weeks. And I had the privilege to meet Kavar. I actually he was my boss, essentially, at Wolverine Pathways whenever I got to serve and teach a class this past summer. So very excited about that. Actually met Kavar through Marie Ting, who was another person in our group leading a discussion for the Woke Church. Well, that said, that's great introductions. My first question, I guess, for tonight, we've heard a little bit about each of your organizations. And I guess you can maybe tell us a little bit more, any specifics that you want to drill down on, and really how or why you first got involved in your organization. What drew you to it? How did you feel God leading you there? And what made you stick around to participate in your organization and the work that you do? Frankie, I see you nodding. Is it okay if we start with you? Sweet.
Yeah, hi. As Brian said, I'm Frankie, and I work for Community Action Network, or CAN, which I'll probably call it most of the time that we talk here. But so CAN works in Washtenaw County. A majority of the work that we do is actually local, though, to Ann Arbor. And we operate community centers in low-income or under-resourced neighborhoods throughout town. So basically, the community center serves as a hub for anyone who lives in the area, like directly surrounding it. So we offer, like you mentioned, educational services for all the kids who live nearby, K through 12. That looks like tutoring, reading programs, summer camps, food after school, all that stuff. Teen programs, so helping kids get jobs in the summer and how to fill out a resume, all sorts of stuff, really expansive. The goal being that kids would be successful in school and be able to pursue whatever it is that they'd like to pursue next. But we know that there's no amount of work that we can do to help a child succeed in school if they don't have any food to eat, or if they don't have a place to live, or if their home is not a safe place for them to be. So we kind of take a step back and we work with families to make sure that all of their basic needs are met. So typically that looks like food and rent and DTE assistance, stuff like that. But truly our staff are dedicated to helping however. So sometimes that looks like helping an adult fill out an application to a job, or, meeting with the principal at a school to help their kid get other resources, or whatever that looks like. And then we learned over time that even if your home is successful, if your neighborhood is unsafe, or if you feel as though, your kids can't be outside safely, or you feel as though your neighbors and you have a lot of conflict, then you don't succeed either. So then we took one more step backwards and say, like, how can we help the community find peace and togetherness? And so, honestly, that looks like a lot of parties, a lot of get-togethers, a lot of time that we're spending where the first interaction you have with your neighbors, or the regular interactions you have with your neighbors, are all really positive. And so, you're doing work together, or you're working on the garden together, or you're, opening Christmas presents, or whatever that looks like. So it's kind of a very round, wholesome approach to social service, but the end all be all being that kids have what it takes to be successful in life. And I got connected to CAN about 5 years ago. I was an AmeriCorps Vista, so I did a 1 year volunteer year, basically, where I work full time and you don't get paid. But it was just a really awesome experience. Honestly, I was looking to just get into the nonprofit world, and that's kind of what it's like. So I did that for a year. At the time, we didn't have a director of development. It was just some staff who were kind of piecing that together. And I worked my way into a job. And I've been doing that for the last 4 or 5 years.
Excellent. I've worked my way into a job more than once as well. So props to you. That definitely sounds like a very full-bodied approach. And I definitely want to come back to the way you guys scaled back over time. So we'd love to touch on that briefly. But first, Dr. Reed, I have to throw the doctor in there every opportunity that I get. Tell us a little bit about Wolverine Pathways and why you got involved.
Sure. Wolverine Pathways is a college access program based out of the University of Michigan, committed to serving 7th through 12th graders and their families from Ypsilanti, Southfield, and Detroit. Our goal is to help these young people realize their college aspirations, think more seriously about what kind of careers they're interested in, but also provide them the kinds of connections and networks that they might not have based on where they live. We come alongside students and families and sort of fill the gap, both a knowledge gap, but also an experience gap that precludes these students from being really competitive in college admissions. Right? What we know is that based on a student's zip code, that'll tell you a lot about that student's college trajectory, right? The possibilities that are open or closed based on the quality of the guidance counseling they receive, whether or not their school offers AP, IB, honors, any extracurriculars, tutoring, et cetera. And so what we do is come alongside those students and say, all right, here's what y'all don't have, and here's what we're going to provide you, right? So we do things such as provide tutoring. We have the students participating in internships. We will provide SAT prep. We essentially serve as their college advisors. We read their college essays. We tell families or give families advice on how to begin to save for college. We talk to middle school students on how to choose the right high school. Anything that more advantaged students intuitively have, we provide for students who don't have. And the goal is very simple, just to support students of color, first generation college students in this college going route, to hopefully lead to a more diverse University of Michigan Ann Arbor or University of Michigan Dearborn. So one of the things that's special about our program is any student that completes our program and gains admittance to one of those two schools is awarded a 4-year tuition scholarship. The way I was brought into this organization was previously I was an advisor at U of M, and I got tired of having the same conversations with students for whom those conversations really didn't make a difference. So I would meet with, pretty affluent students over and over again about whether they should major in econ or math or history. And for the most part, they came from families where regardless of what they majored in, they were going to be all right. And I thought to myself, there's supposed to be like a Michigan difference. This seems more like a Michigan tradition. So I want to do something different. And so Wolverine Pathways had existed, I think, for about a year and a half. And a new director took over, who was actually the wife of one of my mentors. And she was looking for someone who had experience in college advising, but also knew how to be involved in community action. And so the position was created and I applied and I got it. And essentially what I've been doing since then is trying to develop connections with the campus and allowing the college to see that if you want to create a more diverse community, years from now, you have to begin to think about how you can teach your field of expertise to a 9th grader, to a 10th grader, right? In order to both make your field of expertise more legible and more real, but also to pique their interest super young, right? So that by 9th grade, they're not like, I'm not good at math. It's like, you haven't really done it yet. You don't really know what it is, right? But also engaging community partners and corporations who are also looking to diversify and say, hey, if you really want a diverse workforce 7 years from now, you got to start doing high school internships, right? Telling these young folks what consulting is and is not, right? What venture capital is and is not. So yeah, my job is basically to help make diversity work easy for corporations and the university, but most importantly, help folks who don't have advantage really see the transformative power of a college education.
No, I love that, and I love the way you phrased this idea of you don't even know if you're good at math yet. You know what I mean? Like it's too early to tell. And similarly to Frankie's work with CAN, it's there's this walking step by step thing that happens. It's not just a one and done. It's the process over the course of some period of time, number of years typically. that has the largest impact. And Laurie, I know that your work, just from what I've read with the prison fellowship, is similar. It's not just helping inmates while they're incarcerated, it's helping all of those affected by incarceration before, during, and after. And so maybe you could speak a little bit more about prison fellowship and how you got involved in that organization.
So I went to a Bible study for several years, and a woman spoke about her ministry in prison, and I was very intrigued by that. At the time, I did not have time to do it, but I began to pray about it and see if God was going to open up some space for me. So about 4 years ago, I started to look around at the different prison ministries, and I basically just went on prisonfellowship.org. I've heard of Chuck Colson, who is pretty well known, and he's the one who started Prison Fellowship. So the website is pretty great at kind of directing you, because there's many different areas to volunteer in. So I decided to volunteer as a facilitator for the Prison Fellowship Academy. So in each of the prisons that have Prison Fellowship, there's an academy that persons who are incarcerated can sign up for. And each class has about 30 members to start with, and they make a 1-year commitment, and they meet together twice a week, and they have different classes that are all from a Christian worldview. So classes can be mostly skills classes, but there's Bible classes. Personally, I've facilitated classes on finances, parenting, conflict resolution, another one on recovery, and I'm willing to do whatever class that they ask. So as Prison Fellowship, they kind of tweaked their curriculum last year. So with some different classes, but what they've found is the success of the classes for the attenders, about 60% do not return to prison. So they're quite effective. They seek to build community within the prison, Christian community that many of the members have never experienced before, or not to that degree, where they can build some kind of trust within the prison, because it's a hard place to trust people. And members over the year will begin to pray for each other, build relationships with each other, and learn and grow. And that's really exciting to watch. And then at the end of the year, they have a graduation ceremony for the members, and it's just a time for them to share testimonies and for the facilitators to really speak a blessing over them. And it's really a great time of celebration. And for many of them, haven't graduated from anything, so the graduation ceremony is really transformative too. And all of the members are going to be rejoining society. So their release date has to be when the class ends. And so many of them are planning and preparing to return back to regular life. And so these classes are very appropriate and just a great kind of preparation for them. And I've also, Prison Fellowship also does a program called Angel Tree, which is kind of to support families who had a parent that's incarcerated. It's to support their children, kind of encourage them that they're not alone. They churches will partner with Angel Tree and give Christmas gifts to the children on behalf of their parents. So the parents inside the prisons will sign up for gifts for their kids. They will they usually make a guess on what their child would like. And then we call the guardians and kind of confirm that and then deliver gifts. And our small group did that a couple of years ago. And then another event that my husband and I did with Prison Fellowship, or with Angel Tree, is they'll have events for the children and their caregivers in the community. So it was skating in Detroit, and most of the kids hadn't gone skating before. So that was really fun. And I think it was and many of their caregivers came, and there was an opportunity to share the message of Christ with these kiddos and their families. And it was really a great day, I thought. And so it's been a great experience for me to do, and not I go there about 15 times a year. That's what I can do. And I join with many other facilitators around Michigan that do the classes also. And that's pretty much how it works.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, all of you. But personally, I was both an Angel Tree child, so I received gifts from Angel Tree when my dad was in jail when I was a kid. I'll never forget the POD satellite CD, which is so ridiculous. Everybody knows what that is. Frankie's laughing. And a football. But I know it meant a lot during that time in my youth. And also, I have a friend who's basically my brother he's been in jail for 7 years now. He has 2 years left. And he talks to me regularly about the importance of Christian community inside prison and how that has kept him from going down a darker path inside prison. And so all very important work, all very different dimensions. And with that element, I would love to hear a little bit from each of you. And Brian, feel free to add anything to this. What role does your faith play in your pursuit of your pursuit of and passion for justice, right? And specifically in the field that you chose. These are quite different. Education can seem to do a little bit of everything. Prison Fellowship does specifically work with those incarcerated. And so I was just wondering, was there any kind of verses or kind of God moments or just particular passions that drew you to this particular area of justice work? And has maybe got you through some of the tougher moments of it, right? Something that carries you through the longevity. Whoever would like to start.
I can start there. I will say that my justice career started long ago when my mom would take us to this place in LA called the Dream Center. And we would go and do all sorts of, things that needed to be done in the community, whether that was giving out food or helping people. And at the time, I think in my mind, it was just like what you did as a family. I grew up and realized that's not what everybody does as a family, but I feel like that was really the beginning for me. I didn't know how that was going to play out in my life, but as I got older, I came to Michigan. There was a few things that kind of happened to me here. One, I'm from LA originally, where everybody looks like me. And so I had this really harsh realization when I got here that specifically, not just Ann Arbor as a whole, because when you go to U of M, Ann Arbor is like one block. It's not really the whole city, but there just were not a lot of people who look like me, and in general there were not a lot of people who looked very different. And it really was striking that I just felt like there was really an opportunity gap. It became very real for me, and so I kind of got in and out of volunteering work in college. But anyways, I personally feel like my faith is the bedrock of why I do this, right? Like it seems very obvious to me that God cares about this. And the work that CAN does to me is the literal embodiment of loving my neighbor. And like in a very literal sense, like there are literal neighbors. Like on the way to GBC, when I drive there from my home, that's less than a mile away, I pass 3 low-income housing units that hold, 30 plus families each, in my 1 mile drive to church. And I think that a lot of people who live here don't know that there are poor people in Ann Arbor. I think that's a realization that for some people, maybe even as you're listening to this right now, there are poor people who live here. They're kind of hidden, and that's not an accident. And I feel as though this is the way that God is asking me to love my neighbor. And it's very, like I said earlier, it's very holistic approach to that. I love the idea that, kids are getting tutored and all those things that I find incredibly important. But at the end of the day, it's the little things like the Christmas presents that you mentioned, Laurie. Like that's one of, 50 fundraisers I do every year, but it's so fun to see kids get presents from their parents and open them and feel like, I didn't know, that I wanted that, or whatever that was. But it's just a really beautiful ministry. And while we're not sharing the gospel of Jesus, I've seen his hands and feet work there through GBC, through me, through one of my other coworkers who loves the Lord, through many other churches in town who are literally being the hands and feet of Jesus and helping these kids have a chance at a bright and successful future. And sometimes just a bright tomorrow, that maybe otherwise wasn't a possibility. But at the end of the day, to be honest, it just feels like God really cares about this. That seems really obvious. And I want everyone to know that, that it's not like, when did it hit me that's what he cares about? It just like is true. And he talks a lot about specifically the poor, the orphans, and the widows, and they're all here in town. And this is just the one way that I try to help.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Frankie. And I am reminded of many things, but particularly the book of James, one of my favorite verses, one of the verses that changed my life when I first got saved. A religion that is pure and blameless before God the Father is this: to take care of orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained from the world. And so sort of like in the full-bodied work that you're doing through CAN, I'm also noticing this like normalization of caring for the poor, orphans, and widows that even started in your household. Like, I don't know your mom's story, I don't know your family story, but the Dream Center, for those who don't know, is like a multifaceted organization that many ministries pour into in like LA and other cities that literally just goes to like serve people on Skid Row and do kind of practical need stuff. And your family just volunteered to do that, and that is a thing that you right now can do with your family watching. Like you can just say, okay, once a week or once a month, me and my kids are going to do this thing because it's important to Jesus. We're going to, whatever that thing is, we're going to volunteer at CAN or whatever, because this is important to Jesus. And it's going to be a normal part of what it looks like for our household to follow God. But you guys didn't come here to hear me preach. So Dr. Reed Kavar, my brother, would you mind telling us a little bit about how faith has played and impacted your work, specifically in education and dealing with the youth?
Yeah, there's so many different parts of this. So for one, my parents are Jamaican immigrants. They lead a Pentecostal church in the Bronx, New York. Okay. And growing up, there's always been this stigma with Pentecostal churches that we are anti-intellectual, right? We jump, we shout, tambourine, speak in tongues, but we can't tell you nothing about nothing. And so I've always had this drive to pursue higher education and show you can spend a long time at the altar and also a long time at the library, right? You can do two things at once. And so I've always had a heart for higher education, because I've seen the ways in which folks, especially growing up in the Bronx, it's made a big difference when people just don't have access to a college degree. Huge. And then not to mention when you're living in a space where you're not college bound, just based on where you live, right? You're college restricted just based on where you live. And so just that context fueled my desire to pursue higher ed and then make it more accessible to people who either don't think it matters or think it's just beyond their reach. I really love what I do with Wolverine Pathways, because in many ways, I get to be, for some students, a big brother, for some students, a father. And again, I'm working with primarily students of color. We do have a number of students who don't have, strong male presences in their homes, and I come alongside those folks, and I have individual conferences with them and their moms, especially when they're acting up. And I tell them, listen, man, I pay good money for you to be in this program, right? Don't wait. There's a scholarship waiting for you. Don't waste my money. And I love that, because it allows me to feel like, in some ways, these are all my students. Oh, so we have 650 kids in the program between 7th and 12th grade. And then we got like 180 at U of M. So we got 1 million people. I have the privilege of coaching and mentoring many of them. And to me, one of the most transformative moments is just sitting with a young person, and I can get to speak to them from their future and say, listen, you can go to college. Like, I see so much in you, you can go to college. Like right now, you're doing all kind of stupidness. but if you just change your ways, right, there's a scholarship in your future. And then watching students feel like, whoa, he told me he got a PhD, right? If he says it got to be true. And so I think speaking that kind of hope and speaking that kind of life into young people, many of whom don't have those kinds of words of affirmation spoken to them ever, is everything, right? And I think about that scripture, in the last days I'll pour out my spirit among all flesh, right? And your sons and daughters will prophesy, right? Your young men shall see visions, old men shall dream, even upon my handmaidens. And I think about my young people, I think about my students, and I say to myself, this is an opportunity for me, though I can't preach Jesus to them, to live Jesus before them. And in conversations, as we all do as Christians, we always reference scripture, but we can't be like, oh yeah, 1 John, such and such. I love being able to give my young people words of wisdom that are straight from Bible, right? Just straight from scripture, right? Giving them Proverbs, giving them Psalms, and oh, that's really good. I'm like, yeah, isn't it? But yeah, to me, that's the way my faith motivates me. It's like I get a chance to speak into these young people's lives words of life that they're not hearing. Some of them no consciousness of God, not interested in church, but they'll come into my office because their grades are slipping, and I'm talking to them about well, you know what, you're too focused on the things of this world, right? There's something better for you, right? And they're like, oh yeah. So anyway, yeah, those are just some of the ways in which my faith impacts the work that I'm doing.
No, man, I love that. I'm not to ground this in myself, but I think I am a good balance as far as a lot of these different things touch my life. When I look back at some of my closest friends, there are two things, and my family members, the two things that literally define the paths that we took are that I gave my life to Jesus and that I had a college education. I mean, those are just the two biggest things where our paths would diverge. It doesn't mean you can go to, college is not Jesus, but the opportunities that somebody who comes from a lower income situation has. I mean, I remember going, before I'd only been to Ohio and Pennsylvania. And when I did this summer program at NYU that got me my scholarship there, and getting to go to Broadway or to be around other artists and intellectual kids and not feel put out for it, or to be around people of color who were valuing me and speaking words of life into my art and my thing. It motivated me in a way that some of my brothers and that I grew up with just didn't have spoken into them. And so, and it opened my eyes to a world that was outside of what I knew. And so I really think that I read this thing today that said, imagination is the foundation of empathy. Like, imagination is good when you think of creating art and stuff like that, but the most almost like insane superpower that imagination gives us is to empathize with other people, to experience the world through other people's shoes. And I felt like just to be able to be around some things that I hadn't had an opportunity to be around growing up, it broadened my imagination. It broadened my ability to empathize with the world outside of the kind of few blocks that I grew up on, so to speak. So, Laurie, why don't you share a little bit about your faith and how that has just impacted your work that you're doing with Prison Fellowship?
Well, as a follower of Christ, my desire is to live like him. And throughout Scripture, God really has a heart for the poor, the needy, and including those in prison. And Jesus himself says, when I was in prison, you visited me, in Matthew 25, 31 to 43. And the religious ones there said, what? When you were in prison, when did we see you hungry, thirsty, and in prison? And Jesus says, whatever you did for the least of me, these you did for me. And I take that scripture to heart and say, God cares about those who are broken and hurting and in dark places. He cared about me, and I could be in prison too. If I grew up in a neighborhood or had a family situation, like some of the stories I've heard in prison, could be me easily there with anyone else. So I'm no better. And I see that God's grace is sufficient for me, and it's definitely sufficient for them. And that to me is really taking the grace of God, who he offers to me, into the prison, is really speaking those words of life and hope to people who need it. Some of the women haven't had a visitor in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And so having someone from the outside come in with a message of hope that, Jesus cares about them. He loves them. He loves their families, their children. He loves them, and he has a plan for their lives that includes restoration, rebuilding, and hope. That's the message of Jesus. And I feel just honored to be able to give that to people and to have opportunity to walk alongside them in these situations. And honestly, I don't have the answers. I'm just a mom. I'm living in a small town. I don't live beside this. And I don't have anyone in my family that's in prison. I had never been in the prison. The only prison I went to was in college. I went to visit a juvenile prison, but I had never been to an adult facility. And I honestly was intimidated by it. And at times I still am. But once I get in there and we sit in our group and we start talking about what we have in common, which is Jesus Christ and his word, and how God's word has the answers to everything in life. It has the answers on how to solve problems in relationships. It has the answers to how to be free from addictions and how to forgive others and be forgiven. This is the hope that we have in Christ. So this ministry cannot be done without Christ. It is just bathed in Christ and God's word. And that's really where, the exciting part of doing this really is that Jesus himself just offers. He's right there. He's already at work in the prison. He's at work with all these people. he loves them, and to be able to watch him at work there is just a privilege, to be truthful.
Laurie, thank you for sharing and just being an inspiration. What I love about what you just shared is that you made a choice to bring yourself into a space, a place where it might have been easy to kind of just ignore. And I think, and as I was listening to all of you guys share about just the way in which your faith informs your service, each of you guys made a choice and put yourself into a place where perhaps, it'd be easy to imagine these are not places where you'd want to step into. But what I especially like about I was just thinking, especially Frankie and Kavar, when you guys were sharing, and this goes for the prison system too, these are not necessarily Christian spaces. I know, Frankie, you don't work for a Christian organization. Kavar, you work at the same university I do, and so I love that you're preaching there and sharing gospel-infused messages, but they're in the prisons, we don't think of this as a church type of setting, and yet, in all of your responses, you're just loving your neighbor. You're being salt and light. You are sharing hope, and that's from your faith, and you're doing it in settings that maybe we wouldn't normally imagine would be these Christian types of settings. And I just want to call that out, because I think for a lot of folks who don't necessarily find themselves in full-time ministry or in Christian organizations, this question of how am I supposed to pursue justice in my faith when I work with non-believers? I'm in settings where people don't preach or talk about the gospel, and yet in each of your answers, I love the way you kind of just reflect out the faith that calls you to pursue justice. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that, Brian. This is connected to what Brian's saying, and Laurie, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but the next question was sort of about intercultural exchange, right? So I don't want to make the association of race equals poverty, right? Like blackness equals poor people, because that's just not true. It's not factual, and it's problematic. But it does seem like there is a racial element to some of these, to all of your work, honestly, that you guys have been doing. And you guys all are, you guys are all different. You have different backgrounds. So maybe you could speak a little bit about what has been challenging or surprising about the intercultural exchange that takes place, whether that looks like in your chosen field, whether that's serving a poor community and noticing, wow, there's a lot of people of color in the situation, and how you deal with and process through that. Laurie, like I said, you kind of touched on a little bit about the prison system, Laurie, or even in education, right? The difference between, or the Michigan difference in the Michigan tradition, right? There's a level of intercultural exchange that happens in that as well. So that's a little bit of a broader question, but I would love to hear your thoughts on just what have you noticed or found surprising or challenging about any racial dimensions of your work or intercultural exchanges. Did I phrase that right? Did I phrase that well, Brian? He's nodding. He's saying, okay, good.
Well, I can start with that, if that's okay. One of the things I've learned about the prison, I didn't know this before, but is that Black men have a 28% chance of imprisonment compared to whites at 4%. And this is true for women too. There's an unprecedented high percentage of minorities and Blacks in the prison as compared to whites. So this is a question we need to ask. Why? Why is that? I can't say I have the answer to that, but I can say certainly, Kavar maybe could speak to this more, but the education is obviously an issue. People's family situations, whether they were supported in their community. These are all, I think, factors that many of the women that I work with have in common, places where they came from, and and many family members that were imprisoned also. There's a culture within families there that many of their family members are in prison, and that just is like the norm. So this is not good, and I think we need to look at this, and I'm glad that organizations like Prison Fellowship do work on this, and national, and just at some of the laws that are crazy that we have in this country. Like, for example, in Arkansas, if you spell the word Arkansas wrong, you can get fined. So there's weird reasons that people are in prison, and there's a lot that can be done, from on a systemic side too. Now, in the groups that I've led, there's been a mix of all kinds of races together, and that's true for the facilitators too. The field director for Michigan is a lovely, godly African-American woman that we get to serve under, and that part has been really beautiful to watch God's kingdom at work. So together we serve together, we support each other, we encourage each other, and the women do that too. That's really a model of how we can be within the kingdom of God. The women serve each other. They love each other. They are humble with each other. They're open with each other. And that they support each other in a very difficult place. So that's a good thing to see.
Thank you, Laurie. Either of you, Kavar, Frankie, thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'll just share that. Yes, I don't think there's obviously no correlation between race and poverty, but there are correlations between lack of access to education, things like that. And so I'll just share one little kind of success story that I feel like hopefully breaks down it did for me, and hopefully for everyone else, any assumptions they have about the ability of students of color, anything like that. But so Ann Arbor public schools are the best in the state. That's just true, right? They are the best public schools around. Students do really, really well there. But students or what they consider like economically disadvantaged students are graduating at the same rate as any other public high school in Michigan. So, which is horrible. It means it doesn't matter how good the school is, the access is still limited for them. But since I've been at CAN, students who participate at CAN, all of which we would qualify under the economically disadvantaged label, they graduate at 97%. And so that's just literally, there's no special formula. None of us are teachers, educators. We just put in time and effort, and say like, we're here and there's a space for you to do your homework, or here's a snack so that you can concentrate. And I feel like that has been truly eye-opening to the reality that the world is trying to blind us to these stereotypes of what's true or what people are capable of or anything like that, and totally untrue. And there are students of color and just of low economic status in town who are thriving, and they're on the honor roll, and they're doing good in soccer, and all sorts of regular things that we don't like to associate them with. And so that has truly been a blessing for me, and just a joy for me to share with other people that that's possible with our time and effort. And why I encourage people to get involved, because it's just, you don't have to be a math expert. You just need to be able to sit there and hang out with somebody while they do their homework.
Well said, Frankie. And yeah, I have a thought, but Kavar, let's kick it to you first.
Yeah, there's so many ways in which race plays out in students' college aspirations and career vision. We know representation matters. Being able to see someone who looks like you or shares some kind of commonalities with you, comes from the place you come from, in a position that is something that you never thought you would see somebody who looks like you in, is everything. It's everything. I joke with the students that the only reason they can call me Dr. Reed. They have to call me Dr. Reed until they get a college diploma. Then I can be Kavar. Because about setting like this aspirations for like, we can be colleagues and we can talk books together and all that. Okay. So representation matters. It matters so much. But not only does representation matter, but there's so many negative stereotypes and assumptions made about people's educational capacities based on race, and their professional capacities based on race. So I think like 2 weeks ago, we had the CEO of Wells Fargo talking about like, there's no black candidates. They just not out here. Right. And so with that, I go to like corporations like Accenture. I'm like, you heard that? Wolverine Pathways has 1 million black people. Like, come meet them as 10th graders and all that. So that's how I pitch it. But yeah, there's so many stereotypes that students have to fight through. So even when they do get to a campus, they also have challenges from like their peers, right? Like, how'd you get here? Are you a student athlete? Are you of affirmative action? Michigan doesn't have affirmative action. Right? Like, what do we talk? But there's still something in the water about like, well, how'd you got here because you had to fill this quota, right? Like these are the challenges our students are facing on their journeys towards educational success. And one of the difficult things is that for non-people of color, it's hard to understand how those things weigh so heavily on students. It's like, well, they're just being stupid. They're just being prejudicial. That shouldn't matter. You know how much that matters? How much low expectations matter to a student's success, right? And so one of the things we constantly struggle with is trying to develop a sense of resilience in these students, that, hey, you're just as good as everybody else, right? You can do the work just as everybody else. One of the tensions, though, is that especially with when students of color get into competitive universities like Michigan, they try like extra hard to show everybody that they can not just match everybody, but outdo other people. The problem with that is that it leads to significant burnout. Right. So I'm Dr. Reed, I'm not going to take 4 classes. I'm going to take 5 because I'm going to show them I'm a great biologist. Listen. Michigan is hard, man. Like, don't do it. Oh, no, I'm going to show them I'm going to do it. Don't do it. I'm going to show them I'm going to do it. Dr. Reed, I got to take this semester off. I'm just too tired, man. Right. And so like, there are these like weird race related psychological challenges that students of color have to really wrestle with when they're attending predominantly white universities that like colleges don't really understand how to support students around. So it's not as simple as like, hey, yeah, college access for everybody. But when you're bringing them into a space that's unfamiliar, sort of toxic, it makes that journey all the more difficult. And then students either don't graduate or they graduate bitter, which is even worse because then they're going to tell their friends and their children, you're not going to that university. Right. And so, the status quo remains. So, yeah, race plays a huge factor in especially in higher ed.
No, this is obvious. I mean, this could be a whole panel in and of itself, right? Talking about the dimensions of race in each of these things. What I'm hearing right now is that you cannot pursue justice. You cannot begin down the path of justice in whatever form, education, loving on a neighborhood, getting involved in prison ministry, even with like the most Christ-centered organization, without confronting some of the systemic things that have led to the current state of X neighborhood, X community, X problems. And that I've said multiple times over the past 5 weeks, it feels like a full-time job trying to like figure all this stuff out. And it is people's full-time job, but that was it was almost like a refrain of people who were in our woke church book study, especially people from older generation, especially people who were white or were not from lower economic backgrounds, or just like, I just didn't know, like, I'm just not aware. And so I think a deterrent from people getting involved with justice work can kind of be twofold. Either A, they're not aware of the need, like they're not aware of the need or how they might be able to just sit with someone, like Frankie said, or how me having a degree and just being able to speak into somebody's life who looks like me could have all the impact in the world. So they might not be cognizant of that. But then on the flip side, I think sometimes people are cognizant and we don't want to or know how to confront the kind of overwhelming, crushing weight of the system, that it would be the easiest thing in the world for me right now to just like, I thought about this whenever George Floyd was murdered, like to just dedicate my life to some kind of justice organization that like is all about police reform, because the problem is so big. And so some people, that is their calling. Some people are anointed for a specific task to give their lives wholeheartedly to the pursuit of justice as a vocation. All of us, I would argue, are called to pursue justice as a part of what it means to walk with Jesus. And so I guess I just want to set expectations for those listening that like, but in order to do that, you will be confronted with some realities that might not always fit or jive with your perception of reality. You might have to awaken to some things, you know what I mean? To invest some time and research and energy into understanding the larger histories and systems at play affecting your particular neighborhood or X area, a chosen field, chosen cause that you want to give of your time and energy to. Is that fair to say? Would you guys say that's fair to say?
Yeah, I love that point because in the 5-6 weeks of the Woke Church class, almost every discussion that we had some level of saying proximity is everything, right? And if you never talked to one of your neighbors who is poor, you'll have no idea how, they got there, how their vouchers work, or how, all sorts of things that we have preconceptions of. And so exactly like you're saying, like it just requires that we hear, we listen, and, awakening to something could sometimes be as simple as a 5-minute conversation, being like, I had no idea that, kids with IEPs don't have the proper care that they're supposed to get, or, all sorts of things that we think we know about and we just really don't. And I feel like that helps a lot in this journey towards justice.
Yeah, and it's kind of tied to what you said earlier, Brian, about each of these individuals here today and those who are a part of our church or watching who have also participate in volunteering or serving or working in justice-related fields in some way have made a choice. You've chosen to be proximate. Like, Kavar, you don't have to be doing what you're doing. You know what I'm saying? Nobody, you could be doing X, Y, and Z. You could be putting that PhD somewhere else, but you've chosen to be proximate. And that is a choice and an invitation, I would argue, even an obligation that Jesus lays at the feet of the believer. It looks different for everybody. There is a diversity of practice, but we all are called and invited into some sort of sacrificial cruciform living in this area that requires proximate with the poor, the orphan, the widow, the marginalized, the underserved, the outcast, the one who doesn't have a father or a role model. I would challenge you, and Brantley and Ryan, keep this part in, or I'll just text it out, to look up every proverb and Old Testament verse that God says, I will defend the orphan and the widow, or the fatherless. When God says, I will defend the fatherless, the one, I dare you to move the boundary stone for the fatherless. Will not I myself take vengeance and uphold their cause? And so just when you think, before we judge people who are products of certain systems too harshly, we might need to acquaint ourselves sometimes with God's heart for those people, and God's actions towards those people. So yeah, go for it.
So one of the things that came up in our group when we were reading the book was about, folks have a very difficult time thinking about institutional problems, because I don't think they really understand that sin impacts our institutions. That is to say, everything human beings make, humans create, is impacted by our sin nature. And there is, none righteous, no, not one. I don't think there's an institution perfect, no, not one. Not even the church, not even the blessed church of God. And so one of the things that's been helpful for me to think about is, hey, if there are institutions that are problematic, corrupt, whatever, as a Christian, I get to be light there and I get to work within that. But if I'm going to evangelize in a space, if I'm going to be Jesus in a space, I got to know what that space is. Right. And I gotta be okay understanding, hey, this space previously existed in a particular way. And in order for me to kind of understand how to confront that, I need to pray, but I also need to read. So Princeton's president, I think in September, wrote this very interesting letter saying, hey, for 274 years, we've been discriminating against Blacks, Jews, women in college admissions. Right. Fascinating, right? One of the oldest universities. Okay. For many people, it's how's that possible? Well, sin does all kinds of stuff. This is just what we do, as it's in our institutions. The question is, okay, as Christians, what do we do about that? And we do these kind of work. Right?
No, man, I love that. Very well said. Just as we all need the rejuvenating, regenerative, restorative, finished work of Jesus on the cross to impact our personal lives, so too do our nations, cities, institutions, and societies need the rejuvenating, regenerative, restorative, finished work of the cross of Jesus Christ to impact them. We have opportunities to be salt and light in dark places. And you guys can watch my sermon on salt and light, but to speak a new spirit into the societies that we are placed in, the communities we are placed. For the sake of time, this has been redonkulously wonderful for me. I would love to perhaps do a part 2 at some point, but for the sake of time for right now, why don't we end on a note? For those watching who want to get more involved, feel free to plug your organization in this. We will have when we release this, we'll have all the websites and information, how people can get involved in your specific org. But what would you tell somebody, who just is trying to get involved in justice in general, who wants to be more giving of their time and energy, and just live a more sacrificial life in this area? What would you tell somebody just kind of starting off down that path? And maybe, 1 or 2 sentences, what is the most joyful? What is the most, what have you received most in your work? You know what I mean? What is the most rewarding, the most joyful element of this work for you personally? Laurie's eager. Go for it, Laurie.
I am. So one of the benefits to being a facilitator and working with women over the whole year, and the fact that I am limited on time, is that I get to jump in at different points in the year and do the classes. So from the first, I meet the women and I can kind of see who the group is and who they are. And then I come back in September, and then usually October and January, and then at different points. And one of the always fascinating things and amazing to watch is how the group changes over the year. And I'll use one example of a woman. And there's so many stories like this, but she came into the group not real excited about Christianity, but recognizing the benefits of being in a skills class like this. And she would not give her real name to anyone. And she, in the prisons, many of the women will find another name that they pick. It's kind of a way to protect themselves. And it's, there's just such a high level of mistrust in there. And she was pretty tough, as many of them are when they start. And over the year, it was just really incredible to watch her change. And I think the class that really that happens about midway is a abuse class that we talk about. And the one woman, the facilitator that led that class, said that's really what got her. And she was a transformed woman by the end of the year, participating in class, and she did give her real name to the group. And at the very end, in the graduation, she was the one that shared her story and her testimony of how she had had just a horrendous childhood, and almost all of them are involved in terrible relationships too, and just how that had really, she had had some experience with the church, but that relationship had been so dysfunctional and just a mess, and that she had carried that with her. And the class had really helped her see that, a healthy relationship with the Lord and with the organization and other believers that were authentically living out, the life of Christ was so transformative to her. And she had decided to make a decision for Christ. And it was just so obvious in how in her presentation and how she was able to connect with others. And yeah, I think I wish that we wanted to have a written copy of that testimony, because it was so moving and powerful, and we weren't able to because of the prison rules. But that there's just so many stories like that make this work so valuable and rewarding. And I will throw in a plug for statistics. According to the Bureau of Justice stats, 68% of inmates will return to prison within 3 years. But those who go to prison fellowship, 60% of them do not return to prison. That's a huge difference that this organization is making in the lives of men and women throughout our country. So there's many, many ways to get involved with prison fellowship. I would really beg people to look at the website and see. You don't have to facilitate a class. There's just many, many ways of varying levels, including never entering the prison and still being involved in different ways to serve. So thank you for allowing me to share that.
Thank you so much, Laurie. I love that. I love it. Ms. Moore.
So you should also check out CAN's website, because as you can imagine from what I shared earlier, we have just too many programs to share. But all that to say, there are so many ways to get involved, and a lot of need. At the end of the day, we're serving 300 students, which is a lot, but it's not nearly how many students require assistance in town. So any way that you want to get involved, I'm almost positive we have it, because we work with the whole community, family, and child. But I will just share why I think you should get involved. One, like I shared, there are neighbors. They go to school with your kids. They're going to go to school with my kids. They are people who are at the grocery store with you. And I just have so many more connections in town from that, and seeing them around town, and it's just normal, and it's so wonderful, and it opens your eyes to how diverse our community really is. And so lots of benefits there, but also seeing kids realize their potential. Sometimes that's college, sometimes it's not. But seeing somebody feel empowered to say, I can do that, or I'm going to make that decision. Seeing kids say out loud, I'm not going to do X, Y, and Z that my parents did. seeing parents say, I no longer am going to do X, Y, and Z to my kids. All sorts of things like that are coming out from a program that's designed to just be close. That's the benefit of the community center, is out the window we can see your house. Out the window we can see you not in school, or whatever's happening, and you can be a part of that, and you can help us be there for families who need help. You can help us be there for kids who are looking for positive adult relationships that they might not have elsewhere, or young adult relationships. There's just so many great stories of success. Success looks so different than maybe what you might imagine. I do feel like sometimes just like a kid coming is success for us. But there's just lots of ways to get involved. There's nobody who comes and is like, oh, that was a waste of my time. That's just not an experience people have with this organization. But lots of ways to get involved. And more importantly, if you have any questions, you should reach out to me so that I can answer them. And not just about CAN. I mean, working with CAN and working in this industry means that I know a lot about what other things are happening in town. So if your thing isn't this, and it's healthcare or it's food or it's whatever, I'd really be happy to share. I feel like having someone, so you don't have to look at the 1,100, not an exaggerated number, nonprofits in Washtenaw County. If you don't want to go through that database, I have a consolidated list in my brain. So I'd really be happy to help. That feels like another way God is calling me to be of service. So
thank you, and appreciate you offering yourself as a resource. I'll say it before, I'll say it again. I was overwhelmed by the number of human resources this church has, and just the people who love God and are living it out. So thank you, Frankie. Kavar.
So it's 6 ways we define success, opportunities to get involved, and what's the other point? I'm sorry.
Or just like, what brings you joy? Yeah, like what brings you joy about what you're doing? You know what I'm saying? What would you tell somebody who's trying to get involved?
Sure. Oh, okay. So my father's a pastor, right? And so pastors are wonderful people. They have the hardest job in the world. And one of the things I never understood about my father is that my father, growing up at PK, you see everything, right? So my father would like preach to these people, and they would do like the very thing he's like, you don't do. And then then they have to go in his office for counseling about the thing that he told them not to do in the first place, right? And now I'm doing this job and I'm seeing the same exact thing in my own experience, right? One of the things I really appreciate about this work is that it has taught me how to pray for people in situations that are very unfamiliar to me. Like I grew up in the Bronx, but I grew up in a Christian household, West Indian parents, right? So my parents were like, hey, it is 8:00, time to pray and then go to sleep, right? Like that's my house. And I'm working with students now who they were trying to text me at 12:00, hey, I'm out here, whatever. And I'm just like, how in the world is this happening, right? Where are your parents? And I have this tension in me, right, between like the religious man, like, hey, you should not be. And then this man who's like, you're just growing up in a very different context. Like your parents are like 30, right? Like it's just a very different context. So I have this like struggle in me all the time to be like, Lord, help me to really look at these young people as like the people you put in my hands to teach me, first of all, how to pray for people who are in different situations, but also how to love them and show them so much grace. Because again, it's just a very different context. So I'll give you a good example. One of my students texted me the other day, and she's pregnant. She's a college student. She's pregnant, and she was like, Dr. Reed, I was so scared to tell you because I figured you'd be disappointed. Her parents put her out the house, and she was like, I know you've invested so much to me, blah, blah, blah. I didn't want to tell you. And immediately that scripture came to my mind where Jesus is talking to the woman like, hey, where are your accusers, right? I don't condemn you. right? And so we went into immediate action mode. All right, so here's CEW, right? Let's get in contact with the dean's office. Let's talk to financial aid and figure out how it's going to affect your money. Let's talk about how many classes you take. Just in that shift, and I realized like that wouldn't have been me like 5 years ago. I would have been like, now you done messed up, right? The old me, now you done messed up, right? No grace, more like, now you blew it, right? So working with these young people and really praying for them has really grown me in a way that I'm now like, I really feel more of an advocate for them, regardless of the stuff they find themselves in, whether it's stuff they should have avoided because of common sense or whatever. One of the ways we measure success in our program is obviously by the students who get in. So Michigan has a like 20-something% acceptance rate, probably less than that. Last year, 68% of our seniors were admitted to U of M Ann Arbor. So we are cooking, right? We know how to get young folks into competitive universities. And we have like a 98% retention, right? So they are going through. Our young people, they're doing internships all over the place. Morgan Stanley, Accenture Consulting, Toyota, Michigan College of Engineering, you name it. So we're putting like young, gifted, talented, untapped potential in these spaces, and again, creating access and opening up pipelines. I think one of the things I would say to folks who want to get involved in like justice opportunities is that there's really nothing too small. Like, but I mean, there's really nothing too small. Like, someone is on the side of the road, will work for food. You got some weeds breaking out in your yard. Give them a 20, give them a shovel, and now you've done a good deed, right? So like, there's really nothing too small. No one's saying start a nonprofit. There are 1,000 of them we learned tonight. The last thing I'll say is ways to get involved in our program. Please feel free to email me. Part of my job is to create opportunities for regular folks, corporations, U of M faculty and staff to support the college going of young people who, right, for many of whom like have no vision of college or no real sense of how to get there, right? We're really trying to create a pipeline. So if you have, if you are educators, if you work for a corporation that's looking to do internships, if you just have an interest in mentoring, if your job is fun and you want to show young people how much fun you have at your job through some informational interview, all of that is possible. But I think for me, the mentoring is key. I mean, if I can find more kind-hearted Christian people with whom I can connect my students, that is less stress on my part because the vetting process is very real and very extensive.
Beautiful, man. Thank you all so much. Brian, I'm gonna kick it to you.
Thank you, guys. Kavar, Frankie, Laurie, this was just wonderful. We spent these last 5-6 weeks reading through this book, and I know one thing that just hung over each of our discussions each week was that, man, injustice. Like, there's just so much of it. It is so hard to even imagine. Like, how do we? I mean, Kavar, you raised this point that like we're in this broken world. And you just need to open your eyes a little bit and you see like the evidence of that brokenness all around us. And when we're talking about something as big as racial injustice, boy, do we feel small. I mean, as individuals, like how do you even make an impact? And you think about kind of the rippling effects of racial problems into spheres like the ones you guys have talked about on poverty, in terms of access to education, in our prison systems. That can feel so overwhelming. But what I'm so grateful is that you guys put a real face. I mean, not just like a human face, but like you are our faces, right? I mean, amongst us, you guys are pursuing justice. And so I want to thank you for showing us what that looks like, and just the reminder that God's got us exactly where he needs us. I love that in each of your stories, you could kind of connect the dots because God has prepared you to serve in the places you are now serving. And for those who are watching this at home, I believe this for you too. God has you exactly where he needs you. And so, like Frankie, Kavar, and Laurie tonight, I hope you'll just spend time thinking and praying about, like, God, how are these dots connected? I hope that we can be encouraged by, Kavar, what you just told us at the end. There is nothing too small. And Frankie, you say you don't have to be a math expert. On the other hand, you can be a math expert, and we've got math experts amongst us. You don't need a PhD, but Kavar, you can have a PhD and still do justice. You can have 7 kids at home or have no kids at home. You can be young or old. Boy, God's got you where he needs you right now, and there is a lot of work to be done. So I want to thank you guys again for just this really encouraging conversation and for sharing your lives with us. And as a church, we are so excited about what lies ahead.